This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hello, friends. I'm Tim O'Brien. Two of the running topics on this podcast have been the issues of free speech and censorship. I'm really excited about today's guest and today's topic because it gets to the heart of just how shadowy the climate for censorship is. Some people like to say it's not censorship if the government isn't doing it outright. But the problem with that is sometimes the government does have a hand in what we get to see, and more importantly, what we don't get to see. That's one of the things we'll be talking about today, and it all centers on your right to know and how that right may be infringed. Meanwhile, before we get started, if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening, wherever you listen, give us a good rating and review. Today we're joined by J.P. Messina. He's the author of a new book called Private Censorship. It describes a new kind of censorship where there are no government-sanctioned book burnings, no prosecutions, no laws, and no committees. In fact, the state doesn't publicly appear to be involved at all. Instead, the censors are social groups, employers, media companies, social media platforms, and search engines. And sometimes they seem to be working in concert, deciding which speech is censored and which is not. When he's not writing books and for journals, JP is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Purdue University. He teaches courses on political and moral philosophy, ethics, and the history of practical philosophy. JP, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tim. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for putting up with some of the glitches we had before we get started today. But I have an obvious question that you probably hear a lot. And that is, you're in the Department of Philosophy at Purdue, and you wrote a book on censorship. How did you come to write that book? And coming from a philosophy background, how did that make sense for you?
Well, it's sort of a long, circuitous story. So I did my graduate work at UC San Diego. I wrote a dissertation on Kant's political philosophy, Prussian philosopher from the 18th century. My first job was at Wellesley College, working as a postdoc in an initiative called the Freedom Project, which brought a bunch of interesting sort of heterodox off the main line speakers to campus to engage the student community. We're in scholarship programs and events and things like that. While I was teaching at Wellesley, I taught a class called Toleration and Its Limits. That course, we read people like Roger Williams, John Locke, John Stuart Mill. And I had a rule for myself at the time that when I taught a class and was reading a bunch of stuff anyway, I would try to write at the same time in parallel. And so I wrote a paper on free expression, mostly surrounding state censorship issues. So I was interested in various ways in which I thought the scholarly literature since Mill had gotten Mill wrong. Had thought that, Mill's view was compatible with more state restrictions on speech than I thought that he was keen on. And then I had an opportunity to give a talk on that paper to a student audience at Wellesley during their winter session. And we talked in the Q&A for like 90 minutes, and almost none of what we talked about was state speech restrictions. We talked about people getting fired, and we talked about people getting deplatformed. And this was all pre-pandemic. This was in 2019. As you might expect, I wasn't totally prepared for those lines of questioning. And so I didn't have a whole lot to say, but I became fascinated by those kinds of questions and thought that it would be good to have something more developed to say about it. And it turned out that the years that followed that speaking engagement were pretty active on those fronts. And so the timing was fortuitous. And so I was, I approached Oxford and they were interested, and the rest is history.
Well, that's interesting. What made you decide you had a book, though?
Well, you've taken a look at the book. It's organized topically. So it just felt to me like there were a whole bunch of different issues in the sort of private domain that would fall under compelling analysis of censorship, but they couldn't be treated sort of as just case studies in terms of the normative analysis that it required. So I felt like I needed to give employment a different treatment from the news media, from search engines, from social media, from social norms. And so, yeah, it was just the conviction that you couldn't do all of that stuff in one paper, along with probably a kind of youthful hubris that led me to think that I might have a book there.
That's interesting. One of the things that you say when I looked at the book was you talked about the goal and you talked about this being a philosophical treatment of censorship. How would that differ from journalistic treatment when you look at this book as a philosophical treatment?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think that one of the main tools that philosophers have sort of in their wheelhouse, the bread and butter of philosophy, especially in analytic circles, is conceptual analysis. And so one of the things that I was interested in doing, in especially the early chapters, is trying to figure out whether there was a good reason for some of the stuff that you described in your introduction, a reluctance to use the word censorship outside contexts of state action. And that's a task that I felt was foundational to the project that I hadn't seen a whole lot of work done on. That motivated me to think that maybe the Philosopher's Toolkit was part of the right toolkit for the job. And the second thing is that, you know, I'm a moral and political philosopher by training, and I think that those issues of normative analysis are, again, the sorts of things that a philosopher is trained to do. So, you know, I think of a journalistic approach to these questions as being a very important approach. And so I read some journalists who were talking about these kinds of issues. Lauren Soley, for instance, is one of the people whose work I benefited from. But, you know, there's always going to be sense that this is bad professionally, given the sort of norms we want to have about journalism, versus maybe this is troubling in a wider sense, in a sense that the general public should be concerned with.
Well, I agree with that. I have something to share with you along those lines. I have been a member over the years of a group called the Public Relations Society of America. That's the big association for the PR field. And I've been on different committees over the years with them on the national level. And one of them was the Board of Ethics and Professional Standards. We were the keepers of PR ethics. And there were always discussions. I had lots of discussions over PR ethics over the years. And I have sort of a pet peeve with people when they talk about ethics. And it came up a lot there. And sometimes I found myself in the minority. And I'll tell you what it was. It was people would talk about the need for ethics. They would say ethics is key. Ethics is key. But what they would never go to is that next step. And what is that next step? Right versus wrong. Who's to decide what is right and what is wrong? So people would say, oh, you know, we need to be ethical. And then I would say, well, how do you define ethics in this situation or that situation? Because we're going to have to decide what's right or wrong. Because at the end of the day, when I was in this group, we were practically involved with the standards. I wouldn't say we did it, but we set the standards for whether someone could be a member of the society or not because of ethics. So that was always a sticky discussion, and people were always afraid to go to that next step and say, this is right and this is wrong, and we have to take action for what is right. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really thorny issue for a lot of people. One of the things that you'll often have beat out of you pretty quickly in early introductory ethics courses is the idea, not that moral relativism isn't a possibility, but that it's not a default obvious option. So the idea that like what's right or wrong depends on my opinions about it, or the culture I was raised in, or in what my social group believes, or in what benefits me or my social group. Those are ideas that like we subject to scrutiny pretty early. And it's one of those areas in which like the expert consensus in philosophy is at odds in some sense with the sort of pre-theoretical public opinion, where lots of people in the lay public are really sympathetic or naturally drawn to relativistic or subjectivist ideas and ethics, whereas lots of professional philosophers are less compelled there. And so, yeah, I mean, I think those are really big and important questions. I think that there's a lot of wisdom in the idea that we should tolerate lots of disagreement on these questions, and that disagreement can be healthy and promote our better understanding. But there's also a tendency to be squeamish about taking a stand on moral and ethical questions. And I think that tendency, is probably responsible for a lot of confusion and a lot of failures to get to the bottom of things that concern us all.
Well, there's one thing that is a good starting point for the rest of this discussion, is the title of your book, because it gets at everything that we're going to talk about. You call it private censorship. For anyone that's paying attention to the censorship issue, they already kind of know what to expect. But for people that aren't familiar with that, how would you describe what private censorship means?
Yeah, so I think everybody has this sense that censorship is stopping somebody from speaking or blocking someone else from hearing what they have to say. I think that won't do as a sort of sophisticated analysis of censorship, because you have cases where, like, the doctor that takes out your tonsils stops you from speaking and stops me from hearing you, but it would be like hyperbolic, strange, and unmotivated to say that the doctor or the surgeon censored you, right? So you might say, well, maybe that's because the doctor is not doing that intentionally. The speech stoppage and uptake stoppage is just incidental to a different goal that the surgeon or doctor is pursuing, namely your health. And I think that won't really do either, because even when agents stop people from speaking or stop others from hearing them quite intentionally, where that's like the purpose of what they're doing, it can sound odd to think of them as censors. So think about the teacher, I've been in this position myself, who requires that students raise their hand before contributing to class discussions. I think it's pretty clear that some of us, when faced with disruptive students, will impose costs on students for violating a rule of that nature, and might remind students of those costs when they violate the rule. Still, it doesn't seem like people in my position are acting as censors, though there are people, among them my two master's thesis advisors at Georgia State, Andrew and Andrew Cohen, who would say, no, that really is censorship. There's no reason to add any conditions. That's a fine thing to say. We'll eat the costs of the counterintuitive implications there. Myself, I think you can do a little bit more. So the way that I go in the book is I define censorship as a perfectly general matter, as the suppression of expressive activity, where I understand that expressive activity in a fairly broad way, on the grounds that the person suppressing the activity perceives it to be dangerous, threatening to religious, moral, or political orthodoxy, or inimical to the censor's material interests. And that has the happy result of saying that not only is the teacher with rules of order not acting as censor, but ordinary editors aren't acting as censors. So if, Tim, somebody asks to come on your podcast to talk about, their neo-Nazism, and you say, I don't actually think that that's a good fit with what we're doing, that doesn't necessarily put you in the role of a censor. It might put you in the role of somebody who's trying to curate a certain kind of content. But it will count as censorious if you do that because, for example, you're worried that it'll incite anti-Semitic violence or something like that, and then you would count as censor. And then I just say private censorship is just that same thing when a non-state agent is the party doing the suppression.
And I think you read off a list in your book of non-state. What is non-state? And we mentioned it in the intro. It's social media companies. It's media companies that are private or public. It could be NPR or PBS. It could be anybody that does any type of spiking of a story's ignoring of a story when the media does that, for certain purposes, not because it just doesn't have news value. And there are even other ways to do it. In fact, I think there was a case just recently the Supreme Court ruled on in New York where you had a government official that was using their freedom of speech to pressure people to basically censor someone and penalize someone. It became a free speech case. That government official lost that case, and free speech in that case was preserved, or she lost because she was claiming her free speech. I'd have to get into the details of that and have to do some research on it, but it was still one of those things where the government was involved but not involved. They didn't have their fingerprints on the actual actions. She was trying to censor banks. That's what it was. And the NRA. So I think she was basically saying, hey, if you're a bank and you're working with the NRA, you need to back off on some of these things. And so that was sort of a chilling effect because of that. She said she was exercising her freedom of speech rights, now that I recall. And that really isn't censorship like this, but it can also go to other things, because we've seen cases where someone has an email account with a private email company, and their views that they're expressing while protected under the First Amendment may be denied by that email company. That email company might say, well, we're not going to give you access to your email account. Or a bank might decide to close your account because they don't like the views you expressed. So it goes well beyond search engines. What do you think about that as far as that is concerned, when it goes so far into the infrastructure of society that you literally have banks making value judgments on people's speech?
Yeah, well, so I think that in a lot of these cases, whether it concerns social media companies or search engines or employers or financial institutions, the relevant questions to ask are manifold. So one set of questions concerns whether the relevant corporate actor, bank in this case, is acting in its own narrow interests. So there are interesting questions about whether that's a good business practice for banks to engage in. They have at least some incentives to want to deal with more people because their revenues increase when they do. But the sort of narrow questions about whether the institution is acting within its own interests are, in my mind, some of the least interesting, though I think they are important. A bigger question concerns like what happens to our broader intellectual environment when lots of companies in a largely uncoordinated manner begin making controversial judgments about their clients' speech and begin withdrawing from commercial interactions with them on the basis of their speech. And I think like a couple instances of this might not have any very significant effect, especially if lots of other companies are willing to come in and soak up the increased demand for their own rival products. But beyond a certain point, you can imagine situations in which it becomes really risky for individuals to air views on certain topics because they can't get things like loans, or they can't get internet service providers to service their broadband connections, or web content hosts to host their websites, and so on and so forth. And I think there you start to worry that there will be things that are withheld from our debates about matters of common concern that are sincerely believed and might really advance our conversations on those issues, that are withheld not because the speakers think that they don't have a good intellectual reason to make the contribution, but because they fear all sorts of costs that they'll bear if they do go ahead and contribute. And I think that when you have a situation like that, a sort of vital common resource to our collective decision making is compromised, and so some of those institutions have real responsibilities to take a stand and go in a different direction.
You already mentioned what censorship is, and you kind of alluded to this, but I wanted to dig into it a little bit. You seem to think that not all censorship is bad. There are certain good kinds of censorship and bad. And one of them is that most people can kind of come to some agreement on is kids and pornography. Nobody wants little kids exposed to pornography, or most people don't. Most decent people don't. So how would you describe the difference between good censorship and bad?
So there are a number of things that I say in the book. I mean, I think you're really astute to pick up on that. It's not the case that the description of the censorship that I gave you just now is a normatively charged notion. It's descriptively neutral. You can identify censorship on the one hand, and it might be, all things considered, okay or permissible on the other. So the way that I think about this is that censorship is a sort of activity that one engages in, and like all other activities, it's governed by a number of different kinds of constraints. It might be governed by extra constraints because it's interference with speech, and lots of us think that speech is special. But generally speaking, censorship involves imposing costs on people. It involves suppressing their activities. It involves interfering with them in ways that go beyond attempts to persuade them or change their views. And when you're interfering with people for those kinds of reasons, I think that largely to stop what they're saying, I think that the conditions of permissibility are that you're aiming at a worthy goal in ways that don't violate the rights and weighty interests of other people, and that your action is likely to be effective in realizing your goal. And so there are cases of censorship that I think could meet that description. So Mill gives the example in On Liberty of person getting up in front of an angry mob who's concerned about rising corn prices, and basically saying, outside a corn dealer's house, and saying basically like, inciting them to violence against the corn dealer. If somebody were to pull that person off the stage, that might count as a permissible kind of censorship. If you think that, if I'm doing a skit for your widely syndicated sitcom, and I'm going to basically show a detailed step-by-step on how to make a pipe bomb, and we're in a very politically sensitive moment, and there's good reason to think that that might actually lead some people to create pipe bombs and to violate other people's rights, then I think you would be acting as a censor by saying, we're not going to run that skit in your sitcom. But I think it's plausible to think that you would be acting permissibly. Now, I think, there are a lot of things to consider there. For example, one of the things that I talk a lot about in the book is the so-called Streisand effect, where by censoring something, especially in certain media environments where you can't guarantee that other people won't learn that you've censored it, and that you can't guarantee that it won't fall into other people's hands. Well, in those kinds of cases, in those kinds of environments, often censoring something is the best way to make sure people pay lots and lots of attention to it. So that's what I mean when I say that it's not enough to aim at a sort of worthy end, and to do so in a way that doesn't plausibly violate other people's rights, but also, that the action is well chosen and likely to conduce to your goals. That is, that it satisfies what I call in the book the effectiveness constraint on censorship.
Well, it was interesting when you talk about that example of the man talking about corn prices and doing it right in front of a corn grower's or seller's house. And that was almost one of the earliest forms of doxing. When I saw that, I thought, well, he's literally doxing this guy. He's bringing the mob to the guy's doorstep. He's getting them mad. And maybe he walks up to the edge, but then he gets off the stage, and now the mob's all riled up. There's the person's house, and violence ensues. And you're saying that that's not permissible free speech, or there's that line somewhere in there that you have to draw the line somewhere, but where do you draw it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that though you might describe me fairly as a free speech fanatic. I think there are lots of ways to act irresponsibly as a speaker. I think of things like incitement to violence, defamation, harassment, discriminatory speech, and incivility as being ways of sort of exercising in some cases your legal rights. In some cases you'll go beyond even what the law will afford you in terms of your free speech rights, but you're doing so irresponsibly, and nobody has a duty to stand back and let you do that, though they might have various reasons for thinking that they're going to be ineffective, or worse when they try to adopt the role or take up the role as a censor. And so I say basically we should be pretty skeptical that we're in a generally good position to achieve our goals by social censorship. Other institutions might stand to do a bit better, although if you've read the later chapters of the book, you'll know that I think that lots of those attempts to censor have failed on moral and prudential grounds or instrumental grounds.
One of the things that people describe social media, the technical term for it is user-generated content. In other words, the users generate the content, not staff writers like a publisher, like a newspaper. And we do have a model for that, but that gets to a real basic legal question, and that is, if Twitter, now X, or Facebook, or Instagram, if they were publishers, kind of like what you just described, they would follow the publisher model. You would have editors, you would have staffs to basically curate the content. It would be an accepted term that anybody would accept to be on the platform. Hey, there's an editor that's going to look at what I'm going to post and decide whether it's okay or not. I have to decide if I agree to that when I join the platform. But there's a law called Section 230 that says, no, these platforms are basically supposed to be platforms. The users generate the content. As long as the law is not broken, it's free speech as far as the government was concerned when they created that Section 230. So now there's a big debate over that, and I'm not going to get into that here. But I think what that gets at is what you just said is, you can look at social media. There are lies, falsehoods, misinformation for all sorts of reasons. People are either misinformed when they say it. It's just an opinion a lot of times, where it's really not misinformation if you know this person's just expressing an opinion, or a lot of times it's intentional misinformation. And I often say, if Twitter, X, or Facebook, if they were going to basically decide that everything on their platform had to be true, there would be like 1% of the people now using social media still qualified to use it, that they could verify that everything they said is true. It's a humongous task with millions. But we can get into that now, because I think we get into a very, very specific thing. It's in your book, but there's a recent development, and I want to talk about that. And you talk about it. And I think this encapsulates a lot of the issues of the book and brings it home. And that is, when Elon Musk bought Twitter in 2022, he discovered how much the government actually was involved in deciding which content was taken down and which users were banned and shadow banned, that sort of thing. So he went through all of because he now owned the platform, he looked at the internal memos and correspondence, and he just discovered that this was indeed true, that it wasn't Twitter censoring users on its own for all those years leading up to when he bought it. There was a government hand in this. You had government officials meeting with Twitter officials. They use that Orwellian term, safety and trust. They have a department called Safety and Trust. I think it's Orwellian. And they were flagging content or users that needed to be taken down. And you had basically low-level bureaucrats having regular meetings, sometimes high-level bureaucrats having regular meetings with Twitter saying, hey, we saw this user, we don't like what they're saying, we think it's misinformation, take it down. So that's really, and here's the legal case, because I think I think the name of it was Biden versus Missouri, but it was a case where the court came down basically saying the government has a right to speak like that, to tell Twitter platforms and other platforms, hey, here's what we think. And that is true, because you have the health department maybe 20 years ago putting out press releases saying, hey, there's a new infectious disease coming out. We want you to share this information. And maybe they have multiple meetings with the media or social media to say, hey, will you play this up because it's for the public good? That's kind of like a suggestion. And I do that for a living. I contact the media every day, and I talk to reporters, and I offer resources for them, and I try to get them to persuade. But they have the power. They have the power to reject or accept what I tell them. That's the terms of our relationship. And historically, that was always the terms too, for the government and the media. And I would think social media. But something different has been happening in recent years, and that is, it's almost like if there's not a collusion, in other words, if the people in the social media companies aren't of like mind as the government, maybe they're afraid of, maybe there's a little bit of silent, passive aggressive intimidation happening, where they are privately held companies and bad things can happen to them from the government if they don't, become part of the team. So what do you think of that? It's in your book, so I thought you might have an opinion on that.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of interesting questions that you raised. One of them is, what's the difference between what you might think of as the state officials saying to a platform, hey, we think it's a bad idea for national interest reasons for you to be hosting this kind of content. We think it violates your policies. What do you think? Do you agree? Here's an argument for thinking that. And what legal scholars call government jawboning, where there's this sort of tacit threat of sanctions behind it, and where basically government agents are using the existence of soft social power, private power, to do what they couldn't do publicly without violating the First Amendment. That is to censor people and basically offer thinly veiled threats. I think both of those things in certain cases can end up concerning from a free speech perspective, but only one of them seems to me to be censorship per se, which would be the jawboning case. I think one of the things that's really striking about our moment is that the first kind of thing, the sort of thing that you describe that you're interested in doing with respect to media companies and that governments have long done with respect to journalistic outlets, is that it's true that there's sort of a long-standing history of government officials taking an interest in what platforms and publishers say, especially during times of crisis, wartime, pandemics, and things of that nature. But like in the mid 20th century, 1941, FDR created the Office of Censorship. And it was an office, and it was an office of censorship, but it didn't really deploy any sanctions. It was largely proceeded on the basis of voluntary agreements and commitments from the press to avoid certain sensitive issues. And it was a way of coordinating those kinds of things. But they saw it as a sufficiently important thing to let people know about that they actually created an office for it. And I think one of the striking things about what's happening in our current environment is how much it's under the surface and how little people know about what's going on. I think a lot of people can swallow the idea that in certain sensitive times, there might be certain information that governments have an interest in making sure that people don't have access to for certain reasons. I think there's a danger there, to be sure. And I'm not advocating in any way for the return of the Office of Censorship, but I do think there's something more honest about it. They said, look, we're at war with some really nefarious actors, and it really matters to us that we succeed in the war effort. And so we're going to be doing some things with respect to speech that ordinarily we couldn't do. And, you can vote me out of office or whatever if you don't like that I've done it, but here it is. And it's, by the way, it's going to go away, and it actually went away. So, the contemporary analog here is the Digital Services Act in the European Union, which in the time since the book was long out of my hands has gone into law, which actually directs government officials to serve as trusted flaggers of content, and directs social media platforms, especially large open platforms, to remove content when notified by these trusted flaggers that it might be threatening, that it might constitute misinformation, that it might be dangerous, that it might be hate speech, and so on and so forth. And so again, that has the virtue of being transparent. Unfortunately, like, it's going to result in a whole bunch of states doing what I think lots of us think that they shouldn't be able to do, which is exercise a pretty strong hand in determining how ordinary citizens speak to one another on social media platforms. And so, I think it's an open question how that'll be implemented and what its real effects will be. But, it's important to note that there are administrative costs for social media platforms who want to, say, remove the content for EU users, but preserve it for American users. And so there's kind of a danger that, like, the more active governments in other countries are now determining what the rest of the world can see on social media. And I think that's troubling, even if there's no threat of sanctions. But of course, in the DSA, there are threats of sanctions. You can get fined an awful lot of money if you're a social media company and you're out of compliance with this act. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's of interest there, and I guess it shows one thing pretty clearly, which is that though censorship doesn't need to have any state involvement at all to be a sensible kind of thing to talk about, anywhere where there are loci of private power present so many opportunities for powerful state agents with their own interests, narrow or broad. They might concern us all in the case of the World War II censorship, or not so much in the case of maybe some other instances. And they might use those loci of private power for those purposes in ways that are not transparent, and that we have a hard time figuring out what the effects of it are.
Well, that's, you said a lot there that is definitely worth thinking. The great thing about podcasts is if someone listens to that answer, I would suggest, go back, mark this, timestamp this, and listen to that again, because you captured a lot right there. But I'll go back to something now that has happened since the publishing of your book. It's tied to the Twitter files, and it's a new revelation. You mentioned in your book that Elon Musk, when he revealed the information about the Twitter files, he didn't just send out a news release. He released the files, and he said to these independent journalists, you look at them and make your own decisions, and you report on them. I'm not going to spin this for you. And some of those journalists were, this is not all of them, but Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, and Michael Schellenberger. Now, Michael Schellenberger has, all three have Substacks, and I subscribe to all three. And Michael recently has picked up the Twitter files again, only he calls this the CIA edition. And I'm going to put something on the screen, because this is what he said in one of his recent articles on this. He said, and he's talking about some former intelligence community employees, contractors, and intermediaries weren't satisfied with simply controlling Twitter. This is before Musk. They also wanted to use PayPal, Amazon Web Services, and GoDaddy in a totalizing effort to deplatform, demonetize, and excommunicate from the internet entirely those individuals that the intelligence community and others deems to be a threat. And I think that's where we get into some other questions that we probably don't have time for. But how the intelligence community defined a threat, if we were naive, we would say, well, a national security threat, of course, right? But really, when you look at that kind of censorship, I look at it as a threat to whatever narratives they're trying to create. They have for whatever reasons, they have their own narratives they're trying to advance. They are working in collaboration with, Twitter, maybe having the upper hand on Twitter. Because now, how would you like to be a Twitter executive and you're sitting across from somebody from the CIA or some other intelligence agency, and they're gently telling you it will be a good idea for you to take this person off of, PayPal, or if you're a Twitter, take this person off of your platform, deplatform this person, take down their content. That's not the kind of content we approve of. That is very, very Big Brother-ish, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of these cases, these emerging stories, there are really important questions of facts, and I'm not up on all of Schellenberg's evidence, so I'd have to take a closer look. But certainly, when you have the intelligence community targeting individuals that it deems as threatening, what you have is a case of sort of action being taken by private individuals at the behest of state agents that might violate due process rights that persons have. I mean, there's no, in at least the excerpt from the Substack that I read, I'm not a paid subscriber, so I didn't have access to the full piece, but it doesn't say anything restricting the actions to people who are not U.S. citizens, and so. You're really seeing state intelligence bodies exercising real power over individuals in the shadows. And so if that's the sort of thing that's going on, then I think there's some real civil liberties issues there that extend well beyond social media, and having access to Twitter or not might or might not be all that important in the grand scheme of things for your expressive rights, but not being banked or not being able to access PayPal or other payment platforms, not being able to access the internet altogether. Those are some pretty significant costs. I think that some of the tech companies have a really good track record in refusing to cow to that sort of pressure. So I think of various refusals by Apple to play nice with law enforcement when it wanted to, wanted Apple to give law enforcement access to their phones where there's sort of a compelling interest and there is a trial going on. And even still, the tech companies had enough of a sense of right and wrong to say, no, you can't, we're not going to do that for you. We're not going to help you that far. But, not all companies go that way. And there are a lot of public scandals and cases where company executives don't do the right thing and aren't willing to stand up and blow the whistle on these kinds of activities. It's not an enviable position to be in, to have to blow the whistle on the CIA or the FBI. Those are some pretty powerful organizations. But it's not an enviable position to, I think anyway, to be on the board of or in the executive suite of any of these companies in the first place. So I guess you take the costs with the benefits.
Yeah, you do. And I need to put some context into my prior comments, because Schellenberger says it in that quote, but in his reporting, the whole idea of the reporting is you didn't have a CIA employee telling people that. He uses the word intermediaries. So the CIA is like any intelligence agency would be. They wouldn't be that dumb, really, to have an employee sit down across from Twitter and do it. So what they do is they either work through, or even they have their own investment arm, and they have their own, intermediary companies where so-called former CIA employees are now employees of this new independently run consulting firm. But it just so happens that everybody in the consulting firm has some kind of relationship with the CIA. So, but it all goes back to that, and that's where I can't connect the dots right here. But that's where Michael Schellenberger does that in his reporting. So he lays it all out, and he tries to connect the dots, and he can't prove everything. But it's basically one of those things where there's smoke, is there fire? That's what he's asking, and he's naming names and doing all sorts of things. So if anyone's listening, I would advise subscribing to Michael Schellenberger's Substack. I think it's called Public News, and read that, and you can find out more about it. I will also link to it in my show notes on the audio side at shapingopinion.com. So I have one final question for you, JP, and that is, and I know you say this really early in your book, you say, I didn't write this book to come up with all the answers. I wrote this book to sort of ask the questions. But after this discussion and after you wrote the book and after you've had so many other discussions, do you have any idea what the solution might be?
Well, a solution requires a good description of the problem. So I think it's going to, there might be multiple solutions for multiple different issues that are largely disconnected. I think, in some of these cases, the solution has to be holding companies to account for their actions, publicizing their actions when they do the wrong thing. In other cases, it might be, sort of pointing out quasi-fraudulent or fraudulent activities by companies who might say or promise one thing and do something completely different. In the case of what we've been just talking about, it's quite a hard thing to do to sort of hold the sort of intelligence community to account for something that they're, in some sense, they're designed to do. I mean, so RID has this book, Active Measures, if you want to read about the a number of different things that the intelligence community has done domestically and abroad to our information environment at various different points. I highly recommend that book. But I think it's a great service that people are looking into this sort of thing and trying to inform people on what might be going on. I think that to the degree that that stuff comes out publicly, we can at least be aware of what's happening and be aware that maybe some of the content moderation strategies that are lighted upon are not the result of platform executives pursuing their mission, but pursuing their mission in a constrained environment where there are lots of interest groups pressuring them to do certain kinds of things with respect to our speech environment. And I think at the end of the day, one of the things that might incline us toward is something that I've become increasingly sympathetic with, throughout this project, which is this idea that, it's really important to remember that no particular platform, and not even the full suite of Web 2.0 platforms, constitute the public sphere. These are options that we have, but we have many other options for getting our ideas out there. We need to do a good job listening to one another. I think one of the really good things about a more or less open information environment like the one that we enjoy is that it's big news when this stuff happens and when people have done a good enough job connecting the dots. That's not to say that we have no work to do. I think that there's a lot that we can do to make the people who are publishing stories independent in ways that they're not currently independent. I talk in the book about diversifying the kinds of funding models that we have. I wouldn't, like some people, go away from the ad-generated funding model or the subscription-generated funding model, but I would want to supplement it with endowment-based models and university funding models for journalism and for reporting and for fact-finding and for things of that nature. That's to say an awful lot. I think to pose a solution, you have to describe the problem relatively narrowly. You have to have a clear sense of what the incentives are and what the impediments to any solution might be. You have to be concerned that solutions can backfire, that they can make things worse. It's really easy, I think, to hear a description of a set of problems and say we have to do something about this and end up doing something that's suboptimal or worse. One of the other things that I say in the book, aside from the promise that I'm not trying to be conclusive in my arguments, is to say, that we might want to slow down in certain cases and listen and make sure that we're clear about how we're defining our terms, make sure that we're clear about what exactly the problem is that we're trying to solve, and whether the tool that we've selected or lighted upon to solve it, whether it be antitrust anti-discrimination law, employment law, or what have you, is the right tool for the job, or whether there might not be less drastic, less reaching things that we can do individually together and as uncoordinated groups to shore up our information environment and make sure that we have the kind that we need to exercise our democratic responsibilities well.
JP Messina, thank you for joining us today.
Tim, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
To learn more about all that we talked about here, please see our episode page at shapingopinion.com. Make sure to leave a rating and review and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Want to connect? Check out our website, shapingopinion.com. Follow us on the X platform, Facebook, or Instagram at Shaping Opinion. And make sure to join our Facebook group called Shaping Opinion Podcast Listeners. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2024.